Okay, hi. So there's so much fabulousness and conflict and crazy things to talk about in the 1920s, and we will not have enough time in class. So what I want to do in this video is just talk about Prohibition. So this is your 1920s outline where it obviously says Prohibition, and that is in, I believe, the first section. Yep, that first section, section 1. So we know the prohibition officially happens with the 18th Amendment, right? And this makes the manufacture, transport, selling, and consumption of alcohol illegal in 1919. And we said, as a country, we get rid of alcohol first before we give women the right to vote. Got our priorities down pat. So obviously, this is passed with really good intentions. We know this comes from the temperance movement. So how does something passed with such noble intent become such a bloody mess? It was called the Noble Experiment, and it's supposed to help society better, stop with crime, stop with, abuse at home and alcoholism and things that are happening in cities that are bad. And it just goes so terribly wrong, right? Like, oh, it goes wrong. First of all, we have made a law and the government does not enforce it. And that makes us look quite stupid, right? It makes the lawmaking process look stupid. It makes our government look weak and foolish. And it opens the door to organized crime. When you have a commodity that people cannot get legally, and it's in demand, they will still find a way to get it. But now it's going to come in through criminal activity. If you think of drugs today, lots of drugs are illegal. You cannot buy them yourself. So what does that do? It ushers in the activity of all these different drugs and drug cartels to sell them because you cannot get it legally, right? And of course, the gangsters and mobsters of the day are going to make a great deal of money doing all this bootlegging and, getting all of this alcohol illegally to the United States and then distributing it through the United States. And where there is a will, there is a way. Let me tell you, we dog sled booze across Lake Erie. Buffalo, places like Buffalo, Maine, places that are on the border with either Canada or Mexico, hot spots when it comes to prohibition. And I am not kidding you, when Lake Erie freezes, beer is dog sledded over Lake Erie to get into the United States. So when you have a law and it's not being enforced, it looks very foolish. And also, the consumption of alcohol itself is not something that is very distinctly outlined in this amendment, so that's going to be a loophole there. And also, psychologically, we've talked about this. When you tell someone they cannot do something, it makes people want to do it more. And drinking becomes like this taboo, sexy, ooh, there's a bootlegger, and like this thing, you know what I mean? With the speak-easies and everything else. And it's already the 1920s when people are obsessed with breaking rules anyway. So this makes alcohol and the drinking of it even more attractive to lots of people. And they're sneaking around, misbehaving, defying the rules, and it makes people want to do it more. It wasn't difficult to get. You would have places such as pharmacies. Pharmacies would get, 100 proof alcohol to use as rubbing alcohol and other stuff, and then they would lose shipments. There are still a great deal of families who are very wealthy in Buffalo because to this day they made a ton of money during Prohibition because they owned a pharmacy at the time. This is actually a friend that I know that's like this. It's crazy how people are going to make so much money. And you see violent, murderous men like Al Capone now rise to such prominence and such power. So we're going to see from 1919 until 1933, alcohol is illegal. For every single year of Prohibition, Al Capone is going to make $60 million a year untaxed. If you look for the translation for today, that's like $84 billion. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And these gangs that were originally there for protection, for the Italians, for the Irish, for these groups that were getting picked on because they're immigrants, now they so have something to do, right? And now they have, this understanding and this tradition of fighting anyways, and now they are going to compete viciously, bloodily with each other for the passing around of this alcohol. And there's so much money being made. These gangs become so powerful. And the rum running, the bootlegging, all of the stuff, the making of the bathtub gin, which got its name because people literally would mix stuff in their bathtub, is just out of control. And I'm going to show you some art from this time, and there's a very famous one called Tumultuous Times, where just like headline after headline, all these murders, all this stuff that's going on. If you've seen the musical or movie Chicago, you know what I'm talking about. This is just like understood to be a part of 1920s lifestyle, and it's really bad. So you see severe violence and crime ushered in because of this. And to give you guys an example, one of the really famous ones was St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago. This was actually right on Clark Street. I lived on Clark Street in Chicago. It's on the north side. It was a neighborhood. Everybody's like walking to school. It's during, the day, and this happens, this violent massacre. And you have I believe, Italian gang just wipe out this Irish gang, and they left them all for dead in this garage, and it's like right off the sidewalk, and the police found them. And actually that Italian gang pretended to be police and then just came in and gunned them down. So this is very violent. Big cities, urban areas, this kind of activity is happening. Sensationalized headlines. It just becomes commonplace. And we know when stuff like that becomes commonplace, people get desensitized to it. And unfortunately, we could make way too many correlations to the gun violence that we see today, correct? To give you guys an idea, in Chicago alone, 800 gangsters are killed. 800 gangsters are killed in Chicago alone during Prohibition. This is really, really violent and just becomes a part of people's way of life at that time. People also would have like bars open up things in their homes. There'd be like the special knock and the speak-easy or something else. A student brought in pictures, those big old Buffalo homes. And she said their third floor was a ballroom, and it used to be a speakeasy. And she said her grandparents would always go to bed with the sound of people dancing over their heads at night because that's what they did in their house. That's what was going on. And the stories are just out of control. You can still go to Chicago and you can see Al Capone's very famous, it's at the top of the skyscraper, his office, and it was all these windows of Chicago, and he would watch the city that he would tell everybody he owned. Lots of really good movies that cover this. The Untouchables is one of them. There's just this crazy, crazy, crazy activity. One of my favorite stories that just shows how out of control this time is. When we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, we're going to talk about a lot of really talented African-American artists. And one of them was Fats Waller. Fats Waller was an amazing piano player. I believe he actually just died recently, I think. And Fats Waller was, this awesome entertainer, piano player. Everything's going on with the jazz in Chicago. He's all there. And he was walking home from a gig in Chicago. And these men jumped out of a car, and they kidnapped him and they threw him in the car. And I think they put a hood over him, and he's thinking, okay, here I am, a black man in Chicago. We're going to talk about how the 1920s are a terrible time for, race and lots of KKK activity, all this. And he's thinking, I'm dead. And he's driving in this car. He doesn't know where he's going, everything else. He gets let out. It's like 3 a.m. and he gets let out of the car at Al Capone's mansion outside of Chicago. And the guys tell him oh yeah, Al Capone really wanted to hear you play, and he decided, why couldn't he hear you play live? And he played for the party. Everybody's drinking. It's out of control. They're all dancing to his music. He's playing the piano. Al Capone throws them tons of money at the end of the night, and they drive him home. It's just out of control. It's an out of control time, something that we're going to keep coming back to as a theme in the 1920s. Lots of Buffalo examples of this, and one of them is the Saturn Club. The Saturn Club has certain areas of, especially their downstairs, and there's one bar that looks like a door. And if you close it, it just looks like a wall. But if you open it, on the back of the door, there's all these shelves for all this alcohol. And that's going to be how the Saturn Club got around, still getting people to come in and being a speakeasy. But at the same time, if the police showed up, nothing to see here, and you would shut that door. So it's insane. And what we're going to see is, even though the government looks very foolish because they're not enforcing this, how do you enforce this? This is so difficult to enforce. They cannot be everywhere. They're going to try to get to all these different places, but at the end of the day, during Prohibition, the government only gets rid of 5% of the nation's alcohol. 5% of the nation's alcohol is kept from consumption. So that's not really a good stat, right? Women are going to hide their flasks in their garters. That's how we see a lot of garters become super popularized. Men are going to have flasks in hip pockets. And if we look at flasks one day when you're 45, you will see that flasks are actually curved, so that if you were being searched, somebody wouldn't feel that because it curves right to your hip. Liquor is going to be homemade, as we said, and we're going to see a lot of times people make this incorrectly, and it's straight out going to kill people because people didn't know what they were doing. Either it's really too high proof and people are going to die from drinking this, or they would want to, duke people out, and they would put other substances and say it was alcohol, and it would kill people. This is a really, really dangerous time. It's smuggled in. Speakeasies are everywhere. And again, it's just such a widespread activity. activity. So yeah, there's all the partying and there's the glamorous part of it, and there's like the illicit thrill and the speakeasies and everything we see that looms so large in American memory as far as, you know, Prohibition in this time period. But the violence and the crime and the gang activity that it ushers in is going to be enormous. And again, they get that power because they are the ones who are getting the illegal liquor everywhere. That's the underbelly that comes from this. And again, when things get so out of control and these rules are so broken, no one's capping, no one's limiting it. This joyride gets out of control, and there's going to be major repercussions. Again, we see this essentially this noble experiment, the 18th Amendment. It is a failure, right? Causes a plethora of crime, tons of violence, tons of political corruption. Of course, lots of politicians know this is happening, and they are just going to go along with it or get bribes because of it, and they don't really care, right? Everybody is still drinking. It's relatively easy. Many people are killed from this. There's lots of stories of people being blinded by this homemade alcohol that's being made that is very, very dangerous, paralyzed as well from drinking contaminated booze. And the government foolishly created a law that they did not and could not enforce. So as soon as FDR is in office, once we get in the Great Depression, boom, it gets repealed in 1933. Why? Make it cleaner, have it legal so that we get rid of a lot of this gang activity that has now gotten so strong around it, and also taxes. Make the money off of the taxes. And in 1933, when we're in a Great Depression, man, we could use the money from taxing alcohol. So that is a very quick version of Prohibition and activity during the 1920s around it. All right, you guys, more 1920s to come. See ya.